It's about showing you in a quantitative way how inclusion and diversity jointly operate, and in particular, how inclusion can shape both the diversity and the performance of your organization. And I'm going to use a simple example of gender biases in promotion. And the example is meant to be superficial and very simple because I think it will drive home the point. Suppose that we have a company. This is literally a computer simulation. It's what we do at our company. We build these computer simulations. This is the scientific background on the academic side, and it helps us to understand where we're going. That's how we've come to some of the conclusions that you'll hear later. So this company is very simple. For simplicity, we have only two kinds of people, yellow and blue, which are going to associate with women and men. This is not meant to say that we believe that binary genders is the right way to represent things, but we're just trying to make an example, and I hope you will see why we decided to keep it simple. You'll see another example later where we have different kinds of diversity within a simulation. This company is very simple. It has entry-level people, managers, VPs, and executives. People just kind of walk back and forth. They do their thing. Over time, the company grows. Some people leave or get fired, and people get promoted through the ranks. Let's see what that looks like. So here now you should see an animation. Hopefully the connection is good enough, where you see some people floating up that are getting promoted and some that pop up and turn gray and disappear. Those are being separated from the company. The punchline is that when we run the equivalent of about 5 years, we see that no matter what, the balance remains roughly 50-50. There is a bit of variation because of randomness, but the fact is that when you run this multiple times, the number of men and women stays roughly even at every single level of the organization. And then we ask the following question. What happens is if we introduce a bias in the way that we promote people based on their gender? What happens if I now change the simulation so that when I'm promoting somebody, instead of only looking at seniority, which is what I was doing before, if you are a guy, you get a slight advantage. Not that that ever happens in any company, right? But what would happen? What does the simulation tell us? So I change one parameter, run the simulation again, and this is what it's going to look like. And it's a little bit accelerated just so that it doesn't take as much time. But what you find is that with just that one change, look at what happens to the company. You don't just get an imbalance, but you get exactly the kind of imbalance that we see in the real world, where the vast majority of the leadership is now male. And even though we're hiring the same number of men and women, we have more women at the entry levels because they're stuck there while their colleagues are getting promoted. Now, this may seem like a little toy exercise, but in my academic side, with one of my graduate students, we have actually pre-published a paper in which we studied data from McKinsey and Lean In, showing the kinds of gender imbalance that a simulation is able to replicate. And we were able to match our simulation to the data extremely accurately, simply by changing the percentage of men and women that are hired and how much bias there is in the promotion. And as you can see from the comparison between the dark gray bars, which is the real data, and the light gray bars, which is our data, you can see that this model can explain very, very clearly how a simple form of not being inclusive, meaning promoting people with an advantage based on gender, leads to the kinds of things that we see in the real world. So what I hope this particular graph shows you and convinces you of is that inclusion drives diversity. Women are not making it to the upper ranks because they're not being treated equally in the promotion process. And that's just one example of inclusion. Now, I mentioned earlier that inclusion drives both diversity and productivity. Well, of course, when people are not being promoted and they get passed over, their satisfaction will plummet. One of the beauties of these simulations is that we can literally see what's going on inside the brain of every single simulated employee. And whenever somebody finds that a more junior person got promoted ahead of them, they get disappointed. And that disappointment goes away. We use realistic models from behavioral science, but over time that accumulates. And here you can see the yellow line that goes like this is the average satisfaction across all women. And you can see that it plummets and it's much lower than the satisfaction of men. And that translates into dollars and cents because the individual productivity declines. It's very well known that productivity goes down as a function of satisfaction. The team productivity declines, as we just explained in the example earlier, and therefore your overall company productivity declines. So it's a pretty big deal, okay? Now, I'm gonna go fairly quickly through a couple of slides because I wanna get to the more important part, which is the measuring inclusion. And I'm gonna do one exercise that's based on what we do when we're trying to analyze some of these pieces individually. But we just showed you how diversity and inclusion impacts productivity. Now, what I want to do is focus momentarily on recruitment. Again, understanding that they're all tied together, But let's look at what happens, just like in that simulation, we focus just on promotions. Let's look at a slightly different aspect. I do sometimes a whole webinar on recruitment, and happy to invite anybody that's interested in following up on that. But one of the things that we realize is that, again, we think about this from the human-centric perspective. We think about the experiences of individuals. Suppose that this gray rectangle represents every potentially successful employee, that if only you knew them and you brought them into your company, that would be really great. That's the universe of all the potential candidates. What's going to happen is that some of these people don't even know that you exist, because maybe you don't advertise in their space, maybe you don't know how to reach them. So they don't even know, because of lack of awareness, they don't know that you exist. That shrinks the rectangle. Now what happens is that some of the people may just not really care about you. They may be, for whatever reason, they may just think, oh, I didn't even know that this company really was doing anything that was interesting to me. Or you may have a reputation that is actually negative with them. Each of those actually restricts the pool of candidates that is available to you. Eventually, you get people that apply, but we're not done. Because if you don't have a properly trained staff and a diverse staff, unconscious biases are known to creep in to the recruitment process. So you may not even invite people for interviews because of their name, because of their gender, because of their ethnicity, because of a number of other criteria. And those that do get invited, they may go to an interview and somebody might say, oh, you know, I wouldn't feel comfortable going out for beers with that person. Let's not make him an offer. That's known as pattern matching. That's another very, very thorny example of bias that can drive the selection of people. And then finally, now it's becoming illegal in a lot of states to ask for prior salary. But one of the big drivers behind gender pay gap and ethnic pay gap is because of the fact that people that are initially underpaid will continue to be underpaid throughout their careers. And so some people may get a low offer and may not join. And so here are the people that you are actually able to make an offer to. And what you've done is you've dramatically shrunk your pool of talent, which is a big deal, because shrinking the size of your candidate pool will at a minimum cost you money, because, you know, supply and demand. But if you believe that talent is equally distributed, if you're focusing on only one segment of your talent, then you're going to have to go deeper into that pool, and you're going to miss out on some high quality candidates from other segments. So we created another simple simulation that takes this notion of diversity, and especially the diversity score, to show why, especially for growing organizations, embracing diversity from early on is so crucial. So in this case, what we're doing is we have a team, hypothetical startup, let's say, with 2 founders, and both founders have the same characteristics. And if you remember that score, somebody asked in the chat, what is the meaning of that score? So the general idea is the following. Diversity, we think, rather than saying you're Black, you're Asian, you have a disability, you're queer, it's useful sometimes to think about relative diversity. How similar, or along how many dimensions are 2 people the same or different? And so if we're thinking about a country like the United States, where in the business world, the normative majority tends to be cisgender, straight, fully able white men, then a cisgender, heterosexual, fully able Black man would be kind of 1 degree of diversity away, or a white woman would be 1 degree of diversity away. But a Black woman would be 2 degrees of diversity away. Now, don't take this too seriously, but the idea is that it kind of captures the notion of intersectionality, for those of you that are familiar with that. And in this little diagram here, what I'm showing you is 2 things. The little dots that you can barely see underneath the big box for the company that they basically go from lighter colors to brighter colors. Those represent those scores that you just figured out, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but that's relative to a white man who is heterosexual, cisgender, and fully abled. On the left is a histogram. That histogram shows the combined professional networks of these 2 founders in terms of how many people in their networks have a diversity score of 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, just like the game that you played. Before I show you results, I want to show you what happens when you have 2 that are very homogeneous. When I click go, what you're going to see is that the company is going to repeatedly be created by sampling essentially people out of the founders' networks. And when you do that, you can just see visually, or you can look at that vertical bar on the left, which actually shows the representation. But you can see that the company with the results will be highly homogeneous. On the other hand, if we start with even 1 person with 1 degree of diversity in the founding team, what happens is that their networks, by meshing together, become much more distributed, like the one you see on the left. And when you create the company, lo and behold, you get a much more diverse company. In fact, in this little example, you can see that on somewhat, again, it keeps looping over and over again, but you can see that sometimes the company that is created actually has a majority of people who are not diversity zero, like in this case right here, okay? And it turns out that this matters because many hires come from your network, and most people's networks are homogeneous. Therefore, companies that are homogeneous tend to stay homogeneous. Now, I'm going to switch over very quickly just to show you a glimpse of the results that we obtained from you. And it also combines a couple of workshops because we never know how many people we will have. So I wanted to have some data in there. But let me show you, let me share my other screen. And here it is. So this is literally live data. So this histogram is just like the histogram that I showed you in that simulation. I want to point out that because we've been collecting over multiple workshops, and some of the workshops, we tend to get a lot of people who are not necessarily white men. We actually get a histogram that has a peak around 1 to 2. Now, somebody was asking about the number. If you have a number between 1 and 2, so remember 1 and 2 means that of the 5 characteristics that you chose for these other people, on average, maybe they have one way in which they're different from you, maybe 1.5, right? So a score of more than 4 means that it's somebody really different. Like for me, let's say a queer Black woman with a visible disability who was born in the United States because I was not, would have a diversity score of 5 relative to me, okay? Now, interestingly, we can drill down, and this is why we ask you about questions, so about your personal questions. Now we can say, well, show me what these histograms look like for all the people that identified as female. And what we find is that normally women tend to have a slightly more heterogeneous network than men, and I can share that by showing you this. So you see how the men peak at between 1 and 2, whereas the women tend to peak at a slightly higher number. If I do the same thing by ethnicity, likewise, okay, here's race and ethnicity. If I look at white or Caucasian, there tend to be very homogeneous networks. If I take a lot of other ethnicities and races, you can see that the numbers shift over to the right. So this is not just a theoretical exercise. This is truly what happens when we create companies based on our professional networks. Now, I want to go back to the presentation because I still want to get to the juicy part, and I realize that we don't have a ton of time left. So let me go back to, give me 1 second to find my right window. Let me go back to here and share the screen again. What I hope the presentation that I've given you so far has done is to help you to understand why we believe that diversity and inclusion are both crucial to recruiting talent. But really, I want to point out something more general, which is that, and I could go through a similar example with the other 4 pillars that I mentioned before. But really, what you should be asking is the following: not how does diversity impact performance, but if you truly want to understand which of these companies will perform better, you need to understand for every individual in the company, in which company will that individual feel more included.